Claude Respondio, every time you walk into a grocery store in the United States and pick up a tomato, a cucumber, a bell pepper, or a bag of squash, you are holding the result O. Every time you walk into a grocery store in the United States and pick up a tomato, a cucumber, a bell pepper, or a bag of squash, you are holding the result of a supply chain that most Americans have never thought about and that a small group of Mexican families have spent decades quietly building into one of the most powerful food networks on the planet. There are no headlines about it. There are no documentaries. There is no cultural moment where America looked up and noticed that the people feeding it had changed. It just happened, slowly and then all at once, the way every fundamental shift happens when nobody is paying attention to the right things. It did not happen because of a government policy or a corporate merger or a venture capital thesis about disrupting agriculture. It happened because of soil and weather and geography and the particular stubbornness of people who understood something before the rest of the market did. It happened because the state of Sinaloa, a coastal strip of land in western Mexico wedged between the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, happens to sit at a latitude and elevation that produces a winter climate almost perfectly engineered for growing the vegetables that the United States wants and cannot grow itself between November and April. When California goes quiet and Florida slows down, when the frost moves across the American heartland and the growing season in the domestic fields closes, the fields of Sinaloa and Sonora keep producing tomatoes, cucumbers, bell peppers, squash, eggplant, chili peppers, zucchini, watermelons, mangoes, grapes. The list is long and it keeps getting longer. And the families who figured that out first, who planted their stakes in that soil before anyone else understood what it would become, built something that now feeds a continent. The numbers are staggering once you actually look at them. Mexico today supplies 63% of all vegetable imports into the United States. Not a plurality. Not a majority. Nearly 2/3 of every imported vegetable that enters the country comes from Mexican soil. 39% of all fruits and vegetables consumed across North America every single year come from Mexico. The border crossing at Nogales, Arizona, a small sun-baked city of roughly 20,000 people that most Americans could not find on a map, moves nearly 5 billion pounds of produce annually, worth roughly $3 billion, through its ports of entry. More than 100 produce companies operate in the Nogales area alone. Approximately 120,000 trucks cross that border every year carrying fruits and vegetables northward. If you ate a tomato today in the United States, there is a meaningful probability it came through Nogales. The tomato market tells the story in its most dramatic form. In 2000, Mexico and Florida were roughly equal suppliers of fresh tomatoes to the American market. Florida was producing around 1.5 billion pounds annually. Mexican imports were at about 1.3 billion pounds. They were neck and neck, competitors in a market neither dominated. Then the lines diverged. Florida production fell steadily, dropping from 1.5 billion pounds to under a billion by 2015 as Mexican competition undercut prices, as water costs rose, as labor became harder to secure, as the economics of growing tomatoes in the American South became increasingly difficult to justify. Meanwhile, Mexican imports moved in the opposite direction, climbing from 1.3 billion pounds in 2000 to over 3 billion pounds by 2015. More than doubling in 15 years while Florida was cutting back by a third. Today, Mexico accounts for roughly 90% of all imported fresh tomatoes in the United States. The American tomato market, one of the most iconic products in the American kitchen, is now a Mexican market operating inside American borders. And it is not just tomatoes. Cucumbers, bell peppers, squash, eggplant, chili peppers, watermelons. For each of these categories, Mexico's share of the American supply has grown dramatically over the past 2 decades. The avocado story is perhaps the most famous. U.S. avocado consumption per capita climbed from 2.1 pounds per person in 2000 to 8.7 pounds by 2020, an increase driven almost entirely by the availability of Mexican avocados, which now account for 91% of all avocado imports into the United States. The guacamole Americans eat at every Super Bowl party, at every restaurant, spread across every piece of toast in every brunch spot in every American city, comes from Mexico. Has always come from Mexico. Will continue to come from Mexico for the foreseeable future because the Michoacán highlands, where the overwhelming majority of Mexican avocados are grown, produce fruit of a quality and at a price point that no domestic American producer has been able to match. But avocados have a public story because avocados became a cultural phenomenon. The rest of the produce aisle does not have that story. Nobody talks about the cucumber trade the way they talk about avocado toast. Nobody writes trend pieces about the geopolitics of bell pepper supply. And that invisibility is precisely the point. The most powerful supply chains are the ones so deeply embedded in daily life that people stop seeing them entirely. The vegetables in your refrigerator, the salad you had for lunch, the tomato sauce that went on your pasta, the sliced peppers in your stir-fry, none of it arrives by accident. All of it is the product of a system that took generations to build and that now operates with a reliability and a scale that the American food industry depends on completely. To understand how it got built, you have to go back to Sinaloa in the early 20th century. The state's agricultural potential was understood locally long before the rest of the world caught on. The Culiacan Valley, fed by rivers coming down from the Sierra Madre, had rich alluvial soil and a climate that agricultural scientists would later describe as ideal for winter vegetable production. But for most of the early 1900s, the infrastructure to exploit that potential simply did not exist. There were no refrigerated trucks. There were no modern irrigation systems. The roads were poor. The border crossings were rudimentary. The American retail system had not yet developed the cold chain logistics that would eventually allow fresh produce to travel thousands of miles from field to supermarket shelf in a matter of days. The pieces needed to come together before any of this was possible, and they came together slowly, over decades, through the combined efforts of farmers, distributors, infrastructure builders, and government policy on both sides of the border. The first rail car carrying fresh Mexican produce crossed the border at Nogales in 1905. That single car was the beginning of something that would take another century to reach its full scale. Through the early and middle decades of the 20th century, growers in Sinaloa and Sonora built relationships with American distributors and brokers clustered in Nogales, who in turn built relationships with retailers and wholesalers across the country. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in 1994, removed most of the tariffs and trade barriers that had made Mexican produce more expensive in American markets, and the industry accelerated dramatically. Between 1994 and the 2010s, the value of Mexican horticultural exports to the United States grew from a few $100 million to nearly $20 billion annually. A 20-fold increase in 2 decades. NAFTA did not create the industry, but it poured fuel on a fire that had been burning since 1905. The families who built this industry did so across generations, and the stories of individual families reveal patterns that repeat themselves across the region. Someone in the first generation plants the initial crops, develops the first relationships with American buyers, and establishes the basic commercial logic of the operation. The second generation modernizes, often bringing formal education in agronomy or business back to the farm, investing in new technology, expanding into new crops or new markets. The third generation scales, building operations on both sides of the border, developing brands that American consumers recognize, and institutionalizing practices that turn a family farm into a durable commercial enterprise that can survive the inevitable bad years of drought, frost, disease, and market collapse. The Crisantes family is among the most documented examples of this arc. Their story starts in the 1920s when a Greek immigrant named Miguel Crisantes Gatsiones arrives in Mexico with nothing and ends up in Culiacan planting tomatoes with a machete and a mule on a plot of land he calls Campo Santa Fe. He does not speak Spanish when he arrives. He does not have money or connections or any particular expertise in agriculture. What he has is the immigrant's most fundamental asset, which is the willingness to start from zero in a place where nobody knows you and nobody owes you anything. Because starting from zero somewhere new is still better than standing still somewhere old. He plants tomatoes. He learns the soil. He drives his harvests north to Nogales and finds buyers on the American side. He builds, slowly and without fanfare, a farming operation that will outlast him by generations. His son Theodory Crisantes Sr. inherits the farm and inherits his father's stubbornness but adds something new to it. He leaves Sinaloa and goes to study agronomy at the University of California, Davis, one of the great agricultural research universities in the world. It is the 1960s. The American countryside is alive with argument and transformation. Cesar Chavez is organizing farm workers in the California fields and forcing the country to confront the human cost of cheap produce. And Rachel Carson has just published Silent Spring, the book that documented with meticulous scientific care how synthetic pesticides were moving through food chains and ecosystems and quietly destroying them. Theogeri reads it. He takes it seriously in a way that most farmers at the time did not, because the prevailing message from agricultural extension services and chemical companies was that pesticides were modern and scientific and progressive, that they were the solution to the ancient problem of feeding large numbers of people efficiently. Carson said the opposite. Theogeri believed her. He goes back to Sinaloa with a degree and a conviction that grows stronger over the following decades. He improves the farm's operations. He expands production. He maintains and deepens the commercial relationships his father built with American distributors. But the question of how the farm is farming never leaves him. His son Ricardo later remembered spending high school summers helping his father build their first greenhouses out of wooden poles, steel cables, and plastic sheeting, basic structures by any modern standard but revolutionary in the context of Sinaloa agriculture at the time. Theogeri Sr. was always looking for a cleaner, more sustainable way to grow. And in 1990, at a moment when doing so made almost no economic sense by any conventional measure, he converts the entire family operation to certified organic production. The American organic market in 1990 is tiny. There is no unified federal standard for what organic means. The major supermarket chains have no organic sections. Consumer awareness is negligible outside a small subset of health-conscious buyers concentrated in a few urban markets. The price premiums for organic produce are real, but the volume is so low that the economics of converting a commercial farm are deeply questionable. Theogeri's competitors in Sinaloa think he is making a catastrophic mistake. He thinks he is seeing something they cannot see yet. He is making a bet on the future that his children will have to live with more than he will. He makes it anyway. The organic market does not explode immediately. It grows slowly through the 1990s, then faster in the early 2000s as Whole Foods expands nationally and natural food retailing becomes a significant industry category. By the mid-2000s, the organic produce premium is real and growing, and the consumer base is no longer a niche. The Crisantes farm, now operating under the name Crispy Produce, has spent 15 years developing organic growing expertise that competitors who waited to see how the market developed are only beginning to acquire. The relationships Theogeri built with early organic buyers are deep and trusted. The operation's ability to deliver consistent, certified organic produce at commercial scale is essentially impossible to replicate quickly. The bet pays off not because Theogeri was lucky but because he was early and stayed patient long enough for the world to catch up. Then the third generation takes the wheel. Ricardo, Theogeri Jr., and Adrian Crisantes grow up inside the business and bring to it both the intimate knowledge of people who have spent their lives in it and the ambition of people who can see how much further it can go. They invest heavily in greenhouse technology, replacing the wooden pole structures their father built with sophisticated climate-controlled growing environments that allow them to produce organic tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and squash with the consistency and food safety compliance that major American retail chains require. They expand from Sinaloa into Sonora, developing a second major growing region that extends the family's productive season and reduces its exposure to the localized weather events that can devastate a single region operation. They build out logistics and cold chain infrastructure. They develop brand identity. They transform a farm into a company. And then, in the early 2010s, they cross the border in a different way. They build greenhouses in Amado, Arizona, just north of Nogales. Not a warehouse. Not a distribution facility. An actual growing operation on American soil, subject to American labor law and American food safety regulation, producing organic vegetables a few miles from the border that the family's grandfather first crossed with a truck full of tomatoes from Culiacan. The Arizona operation grows to over 1 million square feet of greenhouse space. It is a statement of permanence, a declaration that this is not a Mexican company that exports to America but a North American company that happens to have its roots in Sinaloa. In 2013, the Amato Farm becomes the first Fair Trade certified farm in the United States. Not the first organic farm. Not the first Mexican-owned operation. The first farm in the entire country to earn the Fair Trade USA certification that verifies ethical treatment of workers across more than 300 specific standards covering working conditions, wages, and environmental protection. A family that started with a machete and a mule on a plot of land in Culiacan ends up defining the ethical benchmark for agricultural labor in the richest country on earth. The Crisanti story is remarkable, but it is not unique. It is one story inside a regional transformation that has reshaped the North American food system over the course of a century. Across Sinaloa, families like the Bond family behind Divine Flavor, the growers behind Sunfed, the founders of IPR Fresh, and dozens of others have built operations that now supply American supermarkets year-round with produce that was simply unavailable domestically for large parts of the calendar. In Sonora, in Baja California, in Michoacán, in Jalisco, in Guerrero, in Nayarit, new growing regions have developed over the past 3 decades as investment in protected agriculture, meaning greenhouses, shadehouses, and drip irrigation systems, has allowed Mexican growers to produce at higher quality and higher volume than open field farming ever could. The Mexican government has invested billions of pesos in agricultural subsidies and infrastructure that supported this expansion. American retailers and food service companies have invested in supplier relationships that gave Mexican growers the long-term commercial certainty they needed to make the capital investments that raised quality and scale. The system grew because it worked for everyone involved, which is the only reason any supply chain ever becomes as dominant as this one has. The city of Nogales sits at the center of all of it. On the American side, Nogales, Arizona, is a border city of about 20,000 people that exists almost entirely because of the produce trade. The Rio Rico Industrial Park north of the city is home to dozens of produce importers and distributors whose warehouses, refrigerated facilities, and logistics operations form the physical infrastructure of the U.S.-Mexico Produce Corridor. The Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, founded in Nogales in 1944, represents more than 100 companies involved in the marketing, import, and distribution of Mexican produce and has become one of the most influential agricultural lobbying organizations in Washington. On the Mexican side, Nogales, Sonora, is a city of over 200,000 people, many of whom work directly or indirectly in the produce industry, driving trucks, packing boxes, managing cold storage, processing paperwork, and performing the 10,000 tasks that moving 5 billion pounds of fresh vegetables across an international border every year actually requires. The infrastructure that makes all of this possible is both physical and human. The physical part is visible if you drive through Nogales, the warehouses and refrigerated trucks and inspection facilities and customs offices that cluster around the border crossing. The human part is less visible but more important. It is the network of relationships, built over generations, between Mexican growers and American distributors and retail buyers and food service operators that makes the system function with the reliability that grocery stores and restaurant chains depend on. A supermarket buyer in Chicago or Boston or Seattle can place an order for a specific volume of a specific variety of tomato to be delivered at a specific ripeness stage within a specific window, and that order will be filled. Because somewhere in Sinaloa there is a family that has been growing exactly that kind of tomato for 30 years and has the experience and the infrastructure to deliver it as specified. That reliability does not come from contracts and legal agreements. It comes from decades of relationship building and track record accumulation that cannot be manufactured quickly. What makes the story politically and culturally interesting, and what the original article that inspired this account was gesturing toward, is the invisibility of it. At a moment in American history when the debate over immigration and the U.S.-Mexico border has become one of the most charged and divisive topics in public life, the actual economic relationship between the two countries at that border is one of profound mutual dependence that runs in both directions. The United States depends on Mexican produce in a way that is structural and not easily reversed. The farms, the expertise, the relationships, the infrastructure that deliver fresh vegetables to American tables through the winter months have been built over a century and cannot be replicated domestically in any meaningful timeframe.